Hey, we're going to do a video lecture today. Very, very exciting. So, later this week, you are going to be reading some documents related to America's Great Depression, which starts in about 1929 and really ends along with World War II. World War II is ultimately the thing that's going to fix America's economy during this time. This is probably up until this week one of the steepest declines in America's economy in the history of this nation. And it's easy to point to the stock market crash of 1929 and say that's what caused it. But the stock market crash ends up being just a symptom of a lot of underlying problems that are taking place in many cases during the 1920s, kind of under the surface of the Roaring Twenties, and that just collide and come to a head once we get to about 1929. So you're going to you are going to be making an argument about why this depression happened, and to do that, you're going to want to use some terminology that's associated with the documents that we're going to be giving you. So I'm going to talk through some terms in this PowerPoint, and I encourage you to take notes so that you can use these in your writing later this week. There will also be a short video quiz on these terms at the end of this lesson. Here we go. Here we go. Okay. The first term that I want to share with you is stock and the stock market. You've probably heard of stock and the stock market, maybe right now in particular, because the stock market has been in really bad shape over the last week or so as the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic have kind of rippled over American markets. But basically, what you need to know is that if you have a share of stock, what you have is a share of a company. When you purchase a company stock, you become a part owner of that company. So if you have stock in Apple, for example, you are a shareholder of the company Apple. When Apple has shareholder meetings where they make decisions about the future of the company, you actually get a vote on those proceedings because you have invested money into that company. Why would a company do this? Why would they want to give up their ownership? Companies usually sell stock so that they can actually raise capital. The other way that they can raise capital is to try to sell a whole lot of products and hang on to all that money that comes in from those products. But if they need money in order to finance an expansion or a new research project or a new product that they want to get out there on the market and make profit off of, they often need capital first. And selling their stock, dividing up the ownership of their company, is a way to make that happen. So the stock market is the collection of markets and exchanges where regular activities of buying and selling stocks take place. This is basically where people buy and sell those shares of these different companies. If you want more information about the stock market, I'm going to post the video that's linked here on this classroom assignment as well. I'd encourage you to watch it. It's a TED Ed video, and it does give you a lot more detail about the stock market if you would like that information. But for now, I want to move on to talk about another term. This term is speculation. Speculation means purchasing an asset, hoping that it will become more valuable in the future. So an example tied to the stock market might be investing in what would be considered a really high-risk stock. If there's a company that's out there, maybe like Elon Musk's companies are often a really good example of this. They are often he as a leader of a business is really flamboyant and really controversial, and he tends to invest in things that are like out of a sci-fi novel from the 1950s, right? Tunnels that can go under cities, civilian spacecraft, and stuff like that. However, the possibility of having a huge return on your investment in a stock like that is really high. If we have to leave this planet and go and settle Mars in the next couple of years, Elon Musk's stock is literally going to be taking off. So if you are investing in a high risk or high risk, high return type of stock, that could be considered speculation. It may not be worthwhile right now. When you look at the price of that stock right now, it isn't really worth it, but you are speculating that it's going to be worth much more in the future. Another example of speculation that might be a little bit more familiar to us is the idea of house flipping, right? Where you buy maybe a rundown house because it's affordable, because it's run down for those for those reasons. And you put a whole bunch of money into rehabbing it. I realize my webcam is covering some of the picture of the nice shiny new house, but trust me, it looks nice, right? You invest into fixing this thing up, you put in your own sweat equity, and then you sell it hopefully for a profit. So that would be another example of speculation. Next term is installment buying. I think this is something that we are all familiar with, although we don't often call installment buying by that name today. The basic concept here is that a consumer, a buyer, pays for an item in increments over time rather than paying for it all at once. So an example would be something like when you go to buy a car, right? You don't typically roll up to the car dealership with $10,000 in cash in a suitcase and hand it over to them. You probably make a down payment and then finance the car, right? So you are paying back the car dealership or a bank over time until you pay off the full cost of that car, usually over a term of 5 to 10 years or something like that. This could also be something that we see at a much lower level for something like a dishwasher today, right? Similarly, I may not have $800 to spend on a dishwasher, but I know that I'm going to get paid another couple times in the months ahead. And so again, I might be able to put down some payment now and then pay the rest of that off over time. Today, the most frequent way that Americans do this is by using a credit card. And the idea of using a credit card comes from the other name for installment buying, which is buying on credit. The credit cards themselves, the plastic things, don't get invented until we invent plastic in the 1950s. But in the 1920s and 30s, a lot of Americans are buying things on credit for the first time. Before I talk about this, I just want to say, here, I'll make myself even larger to say it. How you doing? Am I moving a little bit fast? Guess what? This is a video. You can pause me. You can go back. You can slow things down. Feel free to listen to this at the pace that you need in order to get the notes that you need. This isn't like when we're in class together and you guys are like, wait. I have that one more thing I want to write down. And I just keep steamrolling ahead. You can stop me this time around. So on that note, let's talk about income maldistribution. So maldistribution, right, if we kind of break it up, if you cover the word mal and you get distribution, this has to do with how things are distributed. So maldistribution is an undesirable inequality or unevenness of placement or apportionment. You're basically not distributing things evenly. And if it's income maldistribution, the thing that's not being distributed evenly is income, right? If we apply this definition to income or wealth, we can think of income maldistribution as the idea that money or income is improperly distributed among the population. The rich have too much, usually when we're talking about income maldistribution, and everybody else has too little. To give you kind of an illustration of this concept, if you think about Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood, by stealing from the rich and giving that money to the poor, is trying to remedy income maldistribution. He is literally redistributing that wealth from the richest people in society to the poorest people in society. Income maldistribution is something that we still hear a lot about today. This was a major issue in the Gilded Age as well, when people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller hold all of this wealth at the top of society, and the people who are actually working in their factories have very little. Next slide. There we go. All right. Next term I want to talk about is one that we're hopefully familiar with, which is just banking, right? Banks are one of those things where, like so many other examples in class this year, I think we all sort of know what a bank is. And so we don't really think about what a bank actually is and actually does. But here's your definition. Banks are responsible for holding their customers' money. That makes sense. However, banks also use that money to invest in the economy, like the stock market. The profits that banks make from that investment go back to customers in the form of interest, like in a savings account. That's why a bank is able to offer you a savings rate if you put your money in a savings account or what's called a CD. That's why you get money back for letting them hold on to your money. Banks also do all sorts of other things with that money, right? It doesn't just sit in a giant vault behind a big door with the circular seal on it. Banks also use the money that you and I invest to go make loans to other people who are buying a home or starting a business or who need a cash advance to help with a family emergency. So we often think about banks as being very static, but money is constantly circulating within a bank. If the bank ever runs out of money because all of the customers want their money back, then the bank has to close, right? If the bank goes bankrupt, then the customers who were not able to get their money back are out of luck. That isn't as true today as it was in the 1920s, but that's because of some things that are going to change during the time period of the Great Depression. You may have seen this in movies before. There's a scene in the original Mary Poppins, where one of the kids says like, I want my money, and everyone else starts saying, I want my money. And there's what's called a run on the bank. The other big example of this in American film is in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. I will include this YouTube clip in the Google Classroom assignment if you want to watch that. Bank runs are a serious problem because if every single person goes and gets their money out of that bank, the bank ends up actually having to pull investments from people who had offered mortgages to or small business loans, and it basically freezes the finances of the bank. Makes it very, very difficult for customers of the bank to be able to get any money back circulating in the economy, and it basically makes it impossible for the bank to operate. All right, next term is overproduction. Again, I think somewhat of a self-explanatory term. But when we're talking about overproduction, we're talking about the idea that at some point, industries make more products than consumers are demanding. This leads to problems with supply and demand. Supply and demand are like the two linchpins of understanding economic production, right? This has to do with how prices are set. It has to do with how much businesses want to expand. But if you think about overproduction, right? If you think about something that's really common, or that there's too much of something that a company wants to get rid of, what tends to happen to the price of that product when it's been overproduced? Think about it for a second. It goes down. It tends to go down. So two examples of this would be agriculture in the 1920s. At the same time that we are fighting World War I, farmers are being told, you need to feed the troops, you need to feed the nation, you need to ramp up production. So they are, by the time the war is over in 1919, going into the Roaring 20s, they are producing more food than Americans actually need. The other example on this PowerPoint deck was put on here by Mr. Stas, and I don't know a lot of details about this, but basically tulips in 17th century Holland were also a product that was overproduced. I think that's why we associate tulips with Holland today. And that's about all I'm going to say about that. Maybe look it up, see what the details are. I'm curious myself. All right. Last term. Hope you're doing good. The last term here has to do with international payments, and more specifically, the complexity of international payments. This comes directly out of World War I. So World War I created a complex system of debt and taxes amongst the world's countries as part of what were called the reparations of the war. This was all decided in the Treaty of Versailles. Between the post-war debt, war reparations, and international tariffs, the world's countries became more and more interconnected and dependent on one another during this time. Reparations were often levied against Germany, although other countries as well, and basically are a financial kind of apology to the countries that were most harmed by German actions during the war. In order to pay back those reparations, though, so Germany is having to pay huge amounts of money to Belgium and to France during this time period, they're actually having to borrow money from the United States. The United States is also had loaned some money to France and to Belgium, and so they're getting the German reparations from Germany and then putting that money back in the United States. The United States is turning around and giving that money to Germany. So it becomes this circular payment system. The phrase that kind of comes to mind when I think about this is the idea of robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? If you don't have enough money and you owe somebody, Paul in this case, you have to do something in order to pay that person. So maybe that means you got to rob a guy on the street or borrow money from a friend, but then the debt doesn't go away. You just owe a different person. And potentially if you're robbing someone to pay off that debt, you're putting yourself in more and more trouble as time goes on. There's a tariff that's passed during this time period by the United States in order to try regain some control of our international economy. It's a tariff. Tariffs have been in the news a lot over the last year or so. Tariffs are import taxes on imported goods. This particular tariff is called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930, and it places incredibly high taxes on any sort of imports that are coming into the United States, with the idea that we're not getting enough of these international payments back. We need to raise some of this money on our own, and so we make it much harder for other countries to send their products to us. This has, however, some negative effects. This is kind of an example of robbing Peter to pay Paul. We'll see what some of those effects are once we get into the documents later this week. All right, so those are the terms. Now what I'd like you to do is go to the Google Forms quiz on Classroom and answer 4 application questions to be sure that you really understand examples of these terms, so that when you get to the documents later this week, you'll be able to read them and say, aha, this is an example of that complexity of international payments. This is an example of the stock market. And that'll help you make sense of these very, very complex causes that go into creating the Great Depression. Let me know if you have any questions. Good luck.